Christ, save yourself and us. But the other, answering, rebuked him, saying, do you not even fear God, seeing you are under the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong. And he said to Jesus, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus said to him, surely I say to you today, today you will be with me in paradise. So, throughout this whole section, Jesus showed incredible compassion during time of extreme suffering. We don't get all the background here because Luke doesn't cover everything that Matthew, Mark, and John do. But we realize that Pilate had Jesus flogged and beaten prior to him having to carry the cross, and so he was in a weakened state. Remember, he stayed up all night. He did not get any sleep. They harassed him the whole night in the court system, as you were, right, at the house with the religious leaders. They had beaten him on several occasions. They were basically torturing him in a large measure. And so that's why they asked Simon, I should say, to carry his cross. Now, he was an African from Libya, present-day Libya, who was in the area, most likely a disciple of Jesus, and he carried the cross. He bore the cross for Jesus, because Jesus did not physically have the strength to do it. So realize he is in a really physically depleted as a man. And women that were following him, they weren't the women from Galilee that we're going to see mentioned later on. These are women from Jerusalem, and they're mourning, they're lamenting, they're whether they're professional mourners or lamenters that they had in those days, but they were following him knowing that he was going to death, and whether they really were lamenting because of them understanding who he was and anything like that we don't really know. But Jesus had compassion on them, and he expressed sorrow for them. They were expressing sorrow for him that he was going to death, but his expression of sorrow was even more so for the grieving women. Why? Because of their future severe suffering. He could see that these women would be the ones that were going to be in a situation that was going to be undescribable in a short period of time. And that's why he goes on to say that the destruction of Jerusalem would happen in their lifetime, because he says, weep for yourselves and for your children. Because he had already been saying that oh Jerusalem, if only you had known and that they were going to be destroyed. And of course we know that happened in 70 AD, about 40 years later, less than 40 years later, in 66 to 70 AD, Rome went against Israel and finally destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD. And so he says, you better be thinking about your own sorrow. I am. And he said the childless women during that time would handle the painful judgment better than the mothers. Why? Because you think about, mothers is having their own child. We always say that it's not right for, a parent to bury their kids, right? We always kind of say that. It seems like it's not the right thing to do or go. It happens, obviously, because life is not in our hands. But that's what he's saying here, that those who have children are going to have a greater suffering just seeing their own kids go through this, let alone themselves. And he also states at this point that the punishment of Israel will be so harsh that death will be preferred. He says, you'll be asking the mountains to fall on us. You'll be asking the hills to cover us. You're going to be asking to be killed rather than continue to go through this kind of anguish and shame. Isn't it interesting that Jesus, in his moment of suffering and anguish and shame, is thinking about what other people are going to have to go through? Even over and above himself, that kind of compassion. Now, last verse in 31 is kind of like not a parable, but a saying that would have been For if they do these things in the green wood, what will be done in the dry? And it's kind of like if they do these things when God's blessing is on the nation, what do you think is going to happen to the nation when God's curse is on the nation? And it's the idea is that because Israel rejected the Messiah, God's wrath will not be held back in Israel's destruction. If they're going to kill the Messiah in the green, think what God's going to do to them in the cursing. They're not going to get away thinking they're going to get away with it, so the nation is going to suffer severely at the hands of God's wrath. So Jesus first demonstrated compassion toward these women from Jerusalem. In the second group he demonstrates compassion towards is the soldiers. And starting with verse 32, we read that there was criminals, one on each side of him. He was at the center point, right, that they're being crucified. And so they're being nailed on the cross. However, there's very different pictures. He doesn't say here any indication of how they were nailed. Was it through the palm of the hand or through the wrist or, the feet as well? But he was nailed on the cross along with the other criminals at a place that was called Calvary, but it was also named basically the skull. Basically not because it looked like a skull, but because probably that's where a lot of death occurred. And he says to Father, forgive them, for they do not what they do. Who's he talking to? What's he talking about? He's talking to God about the soldiers that are putting him on the cross, crucifying him. And the way I see this, he was showing compassion because he asked God the Father for a stay of execution for those soldiers crucifying him because of their ignorance. They don't know what they do. They're dividing his garments and his lot. They're oblivious really to what's going on here. But imagine, they're crucifying the Son of God on a post. You don't think God the Father would want to zap them? We talk about lightning striking and not being close. You don't think at that point that God the Father, just think of what happened to the executioners of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they threw them into the furnace. What happened to them? Burned up. See, Jesus in his compassion is thinking about the soldiers even more than himself and asking the Father for a stay of execution so that God doesn't just bam them right then and there. As he's being nailed on the cross, he's going, Father, don't hold this account against them for this very moment. Now, this doesn't mean they're going to be in heaven, obviously, right? This is about the stay of execution for that moment in time. But that's where Jesus' focus was. He was on other people. And the third area of compassion we see was with the one criminal. Now, as we move into the text, in verse 35, the people are looking on and the rulers are sneering at him, right? So Jesus affirmed eternal salvation for the believing criminal, but all under the fact that the unbelievers were attacking him. In verse 35, the leaders of the people, they're sneering at him. And he said, he saved others, let him save himself, if he indeed is the Christ, the chosen of God, which is exactly who he is. He's the Messiah, the Christ. He's the chosen one of God. He's God's chosen servant to carry out a task that none of us would have considered very appealing as a son, right? My sons hated it when we had work teams come down in some ways because they always helped me. And as a father, I didn't want to give the worst task to people coming down from the States. I give them to my son. They can handle it. I knew they could handle it, And the father gave the worst task to his son. He's the only one who could complete it. He was the only one who could handle it. But he is the chosen one of God, the chosen servant, the Messiah. They understood it correctly, but they refused to believe that he is. They were the leaders. The soldiers, it says, ridiculed him. They mocked him and offered him sour wine, which was ridiculous. It's not something that, it was to cause more anguish than anything else. And said that he was the king of the Jews in a mockingly way. Save yourself if you really are. Well, he really is. But once again, the soldiers ridiculed him as king of the Jews. See, it's interesting that Luke is bringing out the very thing that you really need to understand about Jesus all the way through the book of Luke. He is, in fact, right, Christ, the Messiah, the chosen one of God, and he will be the king one day. One criminal, now it's interesting, Luke only says one criminal was blaspheming him, but Mark and Matthew say both criminals were doing it, but there was a point in which the other criminal changed his tune. He changed his view. And that's what Luke is picking up on here. So the one that was hanging blaspheming him said, if you are the Christ, save yourself and us. And he's only thinking of himself. And so he rebuked Jesus for not using his power to free them from crucifixion. But they didn't really believe in him. They attacked him. In their attack, they were truthful in who he really is, but they didn't really believe that. So the believing criminal asked to be remembered in Jesus' kingdom. That's what he asked. Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. That statement right there is not what gets him into heaven. What? It doesn't. Because, Jesus says, surely I say to you, today you'll be with me in paradise. Well, paradise and the kingdom aren't the same thing. Paradise, remember, the Old Testament, there was two compartments of Hades, and one was where the non-believers would be, and one where the believers were, and that was called paradise. And when Jesus, in his resurrection, he took that part of Hades, paradise, and took it to be with him in heaven. So basically he was saying today, and he says, with me. You're going to be with me. Very personalized, very, very privileged. So how did he become a believer? How did he do that? Well, first of all, I think you can see in the context, he says, in verse 40, do not even fear God, seeing that you are under the same condemnation. For indeed we justly, but he received due reward of our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong. I think some clear evidences here is that the criminal believed that Jesus is the Messiah. He's been hearing, he's up on the cross just as much as Jesus. He's been hearing these leaders of the people saying, if you are the Christ, the chosen one of God, save yourself. He's been hearing that. And he came to believe that that's in fact who he is. He believed that Jesus was innocent. There wasn't any wrong in him. And he believed that Jesus would live beyond death. How's that possible? Because he said, remember me when you come into your kingdom. When's he going to come to his kingdom if he's dead? Because he understood somehow, right, that he was going to live beyond death. Which brings us to the fourth one. The criminal believed that Jesus would have a kingdom as the king. So he believed what the soldiers were ridiculing him about being king of the Jews. He came to believe that. He came to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ. He came to believe that Jesus is the king, and he's going to establish his kingdom. So he asked Jesus to be remembered, because he is already a believer. So what is he saying? There's nothing really in the New Testament that we have that helps us to see what he's really asking here, but we can go to the Old Testament on a couple passages. First of all, in Genesis chapter 40. Genesis chapter 40, in verse 14. Now this is Joseph in prison in Pharaoh's in Egypt, and remember Pharaoh's servants, the butler and the baker, had dreams, and the butler came to Joseph and asked if he would interpret his dream, and Joseph did, and the butler was so pleased with what he heard. But Joseph said in verse 14 to the butler, "But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me, and make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house." Was he released right then and there? No. He wasn't saved from the prison right then and there. He was wanting, as it were, a reward from the butler for helping the butler interpret the dream in such a positive way. Of course, the baker comes along and says, "Oh, tell me my dream. That wasn't so good." Right? Look at Nehemiah. Nehemiah. This is more asking God. That kind of fits the context. Nehemiah 5. And Nehemiah says this several times throughout his book. He says, "Remember me, my God, for good, according to all that I have done for this people." So and Nehemiah is a believer. He's saying, "Remember me for the things I've done good for the people of Jerusalem in the building of the wall." Look at chapter 13, the final chapter of the book. 3 different verses. He basically states the same thing. In chapter 13, verse 14, "Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for its services." So he's saying, "Hey, God, remember me when it comes to receiving eternal reward." Look at verse 22, the second part of it. "Remember me, O my God, concerning this also, and spare me according to the greatness of your mercy." And the last verse of the book, he ends with the phrase, "Remember me, O my God, for good." Nehemiah understands that God is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him, right? Hebrews 11:6. Well, obviously this criminal was asking, from my perspective, remember me for what? For the testimony that he's giving on the cross. That he was confessing that Jesus, in fact, is Christ, and that he's coming back to establish his kingdom. What did he tell his disciples? That whoever confesses him before men, the Father he will confess before the Father in a reward context. How many disciples at this time were around his cross confessing him as Jesus the Christ? Not a one. They all hightailed it away. They fled. But here's a criminal who at one point in time was criticizing Jesus on the cross, just like the other criminal. But it came to a point while they're up on the cross where he says, "Wait a second. This man is different. He is in fact the Christ. He is in fact going to be the King. I believe that. So remember me in your kingdom." And Jesus basically confirms, today you will be with me in paradise, because he is already a believer in who he is and what he came to offer. That there's life after death. The second thing, okay, Not only did he show compassion during the extreme suffering, but the second thing is Jesus surrendered his physical life. He surrendered it. Now we hold those who executed him accountable. Not only the Romans, but especially the Jews who basically put him the sentence of death. But in essence, he had to give up his life because he didn't have to. He was God. Look at verse 44 to 49. Now it was about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over all the earth until the 9th hour. Then the sun was darkened, and the veil of the temple was torn in two. And when Jesus had cried out with a loud voice, he said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Having said this, he breathed his last. And so when the centurion saw what had happened, he glorified God, saying, certainly this was a righteous man. And the whole crowd who came together to that sight, seeing what had been done, beat their breasts and returned. And all his acquaintances and the women who followed him from Galilee stood at a distance watching these things. How many hours was Jesus on the cross? Anybody know? 6. If you take a look at the end of the night, they took him to the Pilate when daybreak, so that would have been 6 o'clock. All right, and by about 9 o'clock, then he's put on the cross, and at 12 o'clock, that's the 6th hour, because that's the 6th hour from 6. They counted it by daybreak. So at noon, it was pitch black. In fact, it says the sun was darkened. And all the way till 3 o'clock. Well, that's not normal, is it? Well, here's the thing. I see here that you see God's displeasure with Israel. The darkness over the land from noon to 3 was a rejection of what the nation was doing to his son. You think about what happened in Egypt with the plagues, and one of the plagues was darkness fell over the Egyptian land, but in Goshen, where the Israelites were, it didn't. Now all of a sudden, the darkness is over the land of Israel. I think just located it over the land of Israel. So because he's basically saying, I do not accept what you guys have done to my son at all. And the fact that the veil of the temple was torn into two was in God's displeasure with Judaism. Because who led the charge? All the religious leaders of Judaism. And he rent the veil in two because in essence saying, you leaders want to have a religion that only lifts you up, that you're the only ones that can go before me. The veil is torn. There is now access to me, but only through my son. Rejection of Judaism. And you see Jesus' dependence in the Father here. He cried out with a loud voice, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. All the way through his life on earth, we see Jesus going to prayer because he was dependent on the Father. He showed even though he's equal to the Father in regards to the divinity, he was in function subject to the Father, so he was dependent on him. And even in death, he's like, I trust you, Father, with what I'm going through. I trust you even in my death on the cross. Complete dependence on the Father in surrendering his life. And you see the bystanders here at this point were in disbelief that he died. Of course, we know the soldiers in other passages stuck a sword in his side because they weren't sure that he had died that soon, that quickly. But the centurion says, a Roman says, certainly this was a righteous man. His own testimony of Jesus' innocence once again, that why was this man put on the cross? Because the cross was meant for the most hardened criminals, the most the ones that have gone against and murdered and different things like that. They were the ones that were assigned to the cross, not someone like this man who he said was obviously innocent and obviously righteous. Why did he have to go to the cross? And the crowd was beating their breasts in their return back to Jerusalem. It showed that their own grief over Jesus' death. I don't know if it finally hit them at that time. Says, he's dead. They've been following him for 3.5 years, a lot of the people. They've seen the miracles and everything else. He never did anything that would hurt anybody. And now they finally realize, and they're beating like, this isn't Tarzan, okay? They're beating themselves because it's a sign of grief. He's gone. What did we do? Why did that happen? The Jesus followers, the women from Galilee, they stood at a distance to see what would happen to his body because they want to still take care of him. These are the women that followed him all around and helped with the cooking, helped with the finances. A lot of them did. They helped in the housing, the hosting, and everything else. They were there, even from Galilee. They came down. They were the ones that were the closest by because the disciples weren't. They wanted to know what was going to happen. Well, the last paragraph is to prove, and beyond a shadow of a doubt, that he died. That's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. He died and was buried. And if you're buried, you know you're dead. A lot of people would like to say, oh, Jesus didn't really die. Yes, he did. Physically died. Verse 50. Now behold, there was a man named Joseph, a council member, a good and just man. He had not consented to the decision, indeed. He was from Arimathea, a city of the Jews, who himself also was waiting for the kingdom of God. This man went to Pilate and asked him for the body of Jesus. Then he took it down, wrapped it in linen, and laid it in a tomb that was hewn out of the rock, where no one ever laid before. That day was a preparation, and the Sabbath drew near. And the women who had come with him from Galilee followed after, and they observed the tomb, and how his body was laid. And then they returned and prepared spices and fragrant oils, that then they rested on the Sabbath according to the command. See, Jesus' body was secured in a temple. Now, a tomb. Obviously, other gospel writers talk about even the seal, the Roman seal above it, to make sure it was secure. But ultimately, he was dead, and he was in a tomb. Now, Joseph was the one who made the inquiry for Jesus' body. And he was a righteous man, it says. He was a member of the Sanhedrin. Well, I thought the Sanhedrin was the group that condemned him to death. It was. I thought they were unanimous. They were. Well, where's Joseph? They probably didn't invite him. If they knew where he stood, he was not there, obviously, when the Sanhedrin made their vote. Because it was a unanimous decision. And he was not in favor of the decision that they made. It's interesting again that he was waiting for the kingdom of God. You see what Luke is trying to say all the way through here, even in death? Hey, there's a kingdom. I'm still waiting for it. There's a kingdom. I'm still waiting for it. How's it going to happen? The Son of Man's going to establish that kingdom. The interment of Jesus' body in the tomb in verse 53. They took down his body, wrapped it in linen, laid it in a tomb. So if he died at 3 o'clock, basically, then 6 o'clock would have been the time when darkness would have a change of the day from Jewish mentality of darkness. So Friday would have gone to 6 o'clock. And so by the time he died and then got permission, Joseph did from the authorities, from Pilate, have to go all through all that. It's going to be later and later, right? And so the women, there's an interval period of time before they can actually go and prepare his body with spices. They follow where they actually take the body, but they realize what? That they don't have time to go prepare the spices for him in the tomb, because preparation day at 6 o'clock, they couldn't do anything. They would observe the Sabbath. Someone pointed this out. I thought it was quite interesting. Jesus, who was involved as the creator, right? According to Colossians, Ephesians, created in 6 days and rested on the Sabbath. Jesus, as the crucified one, hung on a cross 6 hours. And then it was the Sabbath. See, he was the one that's the fulfillment of everything of creation for mankind. So he endured the shame and agony because it was for our benefit. So we might be with him in paradise. But even beyond that, that we might be in his kingdom. And our desire is that we would be rewarded in his kingdom for confessing him before men, that he in fact is the Christ. May we be faithful as this criminal was. I mean, you think of a small space of time that he had to believe in him. We weren't talking about a few hours. Believed in Jesus after he didn't believe. To believe in Jesus and then to realize that he was hoping for a better place in the kingdom. Jesus says, you got it. Because of your confession. Today. Let's pray. Father, thank you again for the love that you have for us, that you sent to your only Son. The Christ, Messiah. We thank you that Jesus endured such suffering and agony. We can't even imagine the physical pain that he went through, let alone the emotional and even the spiritual, as he took on the sin of the world in that moment of time. Paid for it. We look forward to him coming back to establish his kingdom. May our eyes be on him in his return. Which in his son's name we pray.